Okay, in this video we're examining what I call the problem of self-fulfilling prophecies. The context here is that we are in the midst of thinking about how algorithms are involved in our lives and society, how they're reshaping things. And one of the ways that they do that is by classification. So I'm concerned that classification can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. I'm explaining that here. We'll use our familiar 6-question framework to analyze this problem. All right, so what is the problem? In different videos, I've talked about bias and prejudice, which is built from the term prejudging. That's essentially what's happening in classification. You're making a probabilistic, an algorithm is probabilistically judging you, putting you in a category without having all the information. That's the pre part. So why is prejudice bad? That maybe seems like a really weird question to ask. First of all, because we know that it's bad. We learned that, in kindergarten or wherever. So it's weird to talk about why. It's also, there are some really obvious things about why it's bad. When it creates an explicit formal barrier for people, like in America in the 20th century, when there was segregationist laws, when it said based on the color of your skin, you can do this and you can't do this. Obviously, that's horrible, right? That's very obvious. It's also pretty obvious when those barriers, even if they're not out there in the law written down somewhere, but they're in someone's mind, right? Someone is a racist, that is obviously bad too, right? So someone's going to, be prevented from doing something because of something about them. It's a bit less obvious when those barriers are in someone's mind in the form of expectations. Okay, so this is a kind of unconscious bias, but it's not the exact same category. Okay, so I'm talking about expectations here, not just someone having biases and not realizing that they have biases. I'm talking about how expectations shape reality. And this is a two-sided problem. So the expectations could be embedded in the mind of the gatekeeper. And what I mean by the gatekeeper is the person who's controlling whether you get the opportunity or not. The person who's controlling whether you are in jail longer or not. The person who's deciding whether you get the job or not. The person deciding whether you get your loan or not. That's the gatekeeper. Or those expectations can exist in the mind of the individual as a kind of self-evaluation that I'm not even aware of. Okay, so to further illustrate the problem, let's think about a confusion matrix. So a confusion matrix, this will be familiar to anyone who's done any machine learning or other statistical work in classification. So you have the prediction columns, and you have whether those predictions actually were true, were validated. In the rows, right? So your prediction is a 1 for yes, 0 for no, and if you predicted 1 yes, and actually it did happen, you have a true positive there. Okay, and so you can evaluate your prediction. There's different metrics you can develop based on the different kinds of division. Okay, you know the actual. You have data about the actual, right? You predicted yes, and it was actually yes. Now, maybe that's true. But what about the counterfactual world? So a counterfactual world, we know the actual world. The actual world is the one we're living in. But a counterfactual world would be one where things are different. We could be living in it, but we're not. But it's a possible world. So what about in this counterfactual world? Would the actual have been a 1 or maybe a 0 if the prediction had not been made? So, for example, let's say that someone was predicted, we put them in the category of being a criminal. And then let's say, 10 years later, they did in fact commit a crime. So, one way to think about that is, we made a prediction that they would be a criminal, and they actually did become a criminal. Ding, ding, ding. We got a true positive. So, that seems great, but then you stop and think about, wait a minute, maybe they became a criminal because of the expectation that was generated from the prediction, right? So maybe someone was told, hey, this person over here is a criminal, and then they treated them differently because they were criminal. Or maybe I was told, you're going to be a criminal someday, and I, in a sense, lived up to that expectation. So this is really dangerous stuff, okay? So in this case, the prediction was validated, right? When it came up actual, you're like, okay, my prediction was validated. But maybe the prediction validated itself. Maybe it was actual because it was predicted to be actual. So let me give you a real example. Or actually, before that, let me talk about the Pygmalion effect in psychology. So again, this is just about the power of expectation. I finally found a little graphic here. It took me a long time to find this, but this is the one that I wanted to find. So you have the expectation of the person who's doing the perceiving, and that influences their behavior, and that influences the target's expectation about themselves, what they're going to live up to, which can influence their behavior. And it gets complicated, right? So the behavior could feed into their self-expectation, or can turn around and validate the perceiver's expectation, right? They say, aha, I told you, I knew they were like this. The behavior validates my expectation. Okay, so now let me give you a real example. And I should say this also. This is not, this is fairly well known in psychology, but it's not like universally accepted. And the reason it's not universally accepted is because experiments like the one I'm about to explain, they've had difficulty replicating them, which is a big problem in any science, particularly, any science, yeah. The replicatability of experiments is a big deal. And there's been some trouble replicating the Pygmalion effect in experiments. But let me tell you one real experiment. So in this example, you have two groups. You have military trainers, so people that are training other people to be in the military, and then you have recruits who are being trained. Okay, so unbeknownst to the recruits, the trainers were told, hey, this recruit is a high performer, or this recruit is a low performer, or this recruit, we don't know whether they're high or low, so they're mixed, they're unknown, right? Unbeknownst to the trainers, those classifications that they were given were entirely random, okay? So, a person said, hey, this person's a high performer. They might have been a high performer, or they might not have been. It was a coin flip. We don't know, right? So they were just random. So the recruits didn't know something, and the trainers didn't know something. Now here is really something that's interesting. By the end of the training, those who were, randomly classified as, hey, this person is going to be a high performer, they actually were high performers, right? So I think the way to think about this, a lot of people think, and I'm one of those people, is that this is an illustration of the Pygmalion effect, right? So I was told that this person is a high performer. So without me knowing it, that expectation is in my mind that they're a high performer, and so I subtly treat them differently. I expect different things of them. I expect more of them, right? And this person, they don't know they're labeled, but they're sort of responding to the expectation that I have. And it creates a virtuous circle for them, but vice versa, if I'm told that, oh, they're a bad recruit, then it's a vicious cycle, right? Because I have low expectations of them, and then they're just might live up to my low expectations. All right, what's new about this problem? Well, think about all the harms that were caused in the military training example. Harms to the military itself, harms to the recruits. Both those, two were misclassified. But at least in that case, the feedback loops. So the feedback loop, I mean, like, my expectation, and then someone lives up to my expectation, which validates my expectation, right? That feedback loop. Those loops are relatively slow. And since they're slow, they're more open to reflection and criticism about those feedback loops, right? So someone might say, hey, is this person really a low performer? Because they're doing really well here, right? Contrast that with AI feedback loops. They are automated, they are scaled, they are embedded, and that allows them to move instantaneously. So, for example, consider stock trading when algorithms get involved. And so it's been a little while since I've heard about a flash crash or a massive sell-off, but you do hear about them. Now, the fact that you haven't heard about them in a while probably means that they've figured out a little bit how to deal with them, because they do get that immediate feedback of people losing money. And so they're like, oops, we got to fix this, and so people don't lose a bunch of money. But what about when those feedback loops don't come back together, right? that's a huge problem. All right, another thing about human feedback loops is they're localized. So again, think about the military training example. That wasn't cool to do to those recruits, and there's also harms to the military itself. But it's limited in who it affects and what it affects. AI feedback loops, in contrast, can jump contexts. So for example, if I am classified as a criminal, and that's relevant for the criminal justice system, but you can easily see how that classification can follow you in different contexts throughout your life. That's not necessarily something that would happen in a human feedback loop. Much more likely to happen in an AI feedback loop. All right, what are we talking about here as far as ethical values? Well, clearly fairness. So when the classification creates barriers, it could be ones that are written out there, it could be ones that coming from the expectation of others. It's unfair that I have barriers that other people don't have. Okay? We could also be talking about the value of autonomy, and that is when the expectation, when the classification creates an expectation that becomes a self-perception, a self-evaluation, and then I live up to a lower standard. That's an assault on my autonomy. So potential solutions. Well, self-fulfilling prophecies in a non-digital context, I think, is one of the great moral challenges for us as human beings, right? When our expectations shape reality in ways that can be really unfair and harm people a lot. I think we do want laws in this area as much as we can, but I think the goal of the laws is to make the problem only as bad as it already is, right? To make the AI feedback loops only as bad as human feedback loops, which are slow and localized. We can maybe have some hope there. But this is a really challenging, serious problem, and it's one thing that makes me skeptical about. We need to be really careful about classification in general for just this reason. Okay, so that was a bit about self-fulfilling prophecies.